Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Config Management Best Practices. My name is Joseph Hall, and this guy here is Cody Crawford. You want to go ahead and just get started?
Yeah, let's dive in.
So first off, we want to start off with a quick refresher. Raise your hand if you've used Salt before. Good. I asked the question a few days ago, and not many hands went up. It was interesting. So quick refresher. This is going to be important, the points we touch on here. First off, execution modules. We all know what execution modules are, right? They are designed to do the heavy lifting. They're designed to do all the work. Just in general, throughout Salt, execution modules should be doing the work. A state module is there to wrap logic around that work to make it stateful. Okay? If there's logic in the state module, outside of just, true, false, none, if there's a whole lot of logic in there, it should all be there to make things stateful. It shouldn't be affecting any changes to the system. It shouldn't be doing anything that stands outside of the state functionality. All that should be done inside the execution module. And then let's talk about how things map over. You want to grab this real quick?
Before we move on, I think it's worth pointing out, as Joseph was saying, I wanted to point this out in documentation just to make sure it's extra clear. And let me see if I can get this where you guys can take a look at it. So we're going to be referring to the SaltStack documentation, and hopefully that comes up nicely. So one thing we want to take a look at here is this. You see these two boxes, and we've got execution modules here, which Joseph mentioned that these do a lot of the heavy lifting, and they are utilized by the state modules, where a lot of the logic lives. So if we go over here and take a look at this, let's see if I can pull this off. We're looking at this window here.
Can you guys all hear? Can you guys all hear him? Okay.
Oh.
Move your mic up.
So let's take one of these state modules and see. Let me see if I can quickly get down to one that we're all familiar with. And in particular, I'm looking for one that we use every day. So right here, file. So the thing to point out here, looking at file managed, and there we go. So let's scoot up just a little bit. So as Joseph was pointing out, the logic is contained in these, and as we'll see if we looked at these, this diagram of breaking down what the components are in the state declaration. The important thing to notice is that we're in the file module. We're looking at the managed function, and then keep in mind that these arguments in this function definition are very important. That's what you're going to see in your YAML as you describe the state that you're using. And again, this may be a refresher for a lot of you. We want to make sure that this is extra clear because this is the pattern you're going to keep coming back to over and over again as you develop these state declarations. So one of the most important things as you grow your states and your state definitions and you nurture this in your organization, in your environment, in your teams, is that you're going to have a growing set of these. You're going to have this be a living, breathing process. You're going to have these, this growing body, and you're going to decide based on maybe some of the things we give you today as best practices, and just your workflow, what works best for you, how this is going to grow moving forward. And naturally, you're going to have new team members come into your team. You may have some leave. And what you want to make sure of, the very top point in the slide that I want to point out is that the way you can help new team members get up to speed, even if they have a background in Salt, is to maintain a style guide, right?
Can I just jump in real quick?
Go ahead.
I met a guy a few years ago. His name is Damian Conway. He's a big Perl guy. And one thing that he likes to say is, I don't care what your style guide is, so long as you have one. Really, really important. We'll talk about different ways of declaring states and the old way versus the new way. Choose something.
And you know, put it in writing and have it readily available for the new guys to help ramp them up, right? My background is in operations for many, many years. This is something that I'm very passionate about, that I feel like if you're vetting your candidates, bringing them to the team, and you've got a style guide in place that explains how your particular shop will, you know, use this and put SALT into practice on your team in particular, this individual should be able to come up to speed and contribute before the end of his first day, right? He should be able to contribute something meaningful because he has this style guide and is able to get his head around how SALT is in practice at that organization.
Your mic needs to either be moved or dialed way up. I have a feeling people in the back can't hear you at all.
Let me see if I can correct that. How's that? Better, guys?
Guys in the back, no. I think you're going to have to hold it or switch mics with me.
I can just hold it. Okay, so we'll see some of these going forward. A lot of these concepts that are listed here, but you know, one of the things that, you know, moving on is if you're taking your first foray into this, it's important to note that because YAML and Jinja are our defaults for our renderer and our templating language, unless you have a very good reason and imperative in your organization that maybe you use Mako, maybe there's a lot of knowledge around Mako or Wimpy as a templating language, you know, it's great to stick with the defaults because just about all the documentation you're going to see in the SALT community is going to leverage Jinja and YAML first, right? And I won't touch on too much more of the states for reuse. We're going to hit on those in more depth as we move forward. But I do want to call out a couple of patterns, some simple, you know, very simple things that make life a little easier. The first is that I typically see a lot of folks talking to me and mentioning use case, and you know, we have the idea of the SALT event bus and the SALT file system that are great. They're very high speed. They're very easy to utilize. But I continually see folks with a pattern of saying, well, I can take a lot of these large binaries and the things that I need to distribute to these minions, and I can push them across that. And the answer is no, I wouldn't do that, right? You're leveraging this in a way that's going to burden that SALT file system, and you're using that as a point of, you know, it's kind of a bottleneck for distributing files, right? So the pattern should be have the minions themselves, where the states are rendered, have those minions pull in the things you need that are binary blobs, right? And we'll get on to version control and those smaller bits of information that are best kept there. But in this case, we do have, right now, we have a couple of object storage modules that you can plug in and use. And this has worked very well for me in the past.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind, not just inside of config management, but in SALT in general, you have a couple points where things are executed, where the load happens. The master does some load, the minion does some load. For instance, grains are generated by the minion, and pillars are generated on the master for the minion. And so you need to keep in mind where the processing is happening, where you want it to be happening, and if you have, you know, 5,000 minions requesting a file from the master, then there's going to be a lot of processing going on the master. So third-party services are the way to go here.
And the last quick one on that slide is just a quick little best practice that, you know, it's easy to do and it's easy to not consider, but especially if you are moving away from other tools that may be kind of overlapping in the functionality that SALT is providing, you know, it's simple to just say, hey, if someone may be not aware of that, throw some comments in the files that you're managing to say, hey, this is a SALT managed file. Don't step on it because it's going to, next time we do a state run, it's going to get wiped out, whatever your changes were. So. So for the next one, as I mentioned here, if you're keeping those binaries in the right place and fetching from the right places, then what you really end up having is a small set of, it really amounts to a small set of text that you're managing with these YAML and Jinja files, right? And as we start to build out your set of states in your organization to manage all this, SaltStack is all about data, right? This is really just managing data, managing the process of which you need to get things in, in the right state. And this is, to coin a more popular phrase in the industry, this is really infrastructure as code. You're describing how you want your minions, your process, your data center to look, and as you do that, you're starting to take on a lot of the, there's a lot of similarity into a development process for an application, right? So in modern operations, that's what we're expected to start behaving as, right? We have to manage this as a developer would manage an app. So a lot of the same concepts apply here. And the first one you think about is multiple folks managing the same, more or less, code base, and so we don't want them stepping on each other. So first best practice, I encounter a lot of folks that are getting into Salt. First thing is get the stuff into version control, and that may be whatever you're already leveraging in-house, whatever makes sense for you, but we do have Git, Mercurial, and Subversion modules. To add to that, those modules are made to expose a file root, as you may be familiar with, so rather than /serve/salt, on the local file system, we're moving that into version control. And I've just got a simple example here because if you look at our GitFS configuration page, it is rather lengthy and very complex. So I frequently get asked this: what's the quickest, the quick start for getting GitFS going? And here it is. And I will say, if you find that in practice that GitFS module and that process isn't working for you, I have a lot of colleagues that go on site and help a lot of customers, and it's really what works for you and your process. You may want to roll your own using the Git client, and you can actually get that going in a very elegant fashion with reactors. So someone does a commit, and there's a hook that fires it off, and then Salt knows that it needs to do a new clone and update.
So something you want to keep in mind as you're building out your state tree is the directory structure that you want to use. It's really easy to make directory structures that are really, really complicated and really, really hard to find things. We want to keep our directory structure as simple as possible. We want to, a big recommendation that you hear a lot is to keep your directory structure shallow. Don't have, editors, and then inside editors, Vim and Emacs, and then, databases. No, have a Vim state directory, have an Emacs directory, have a Postgres directory, have a MariaDB directory, and so on. If it's a file that's not an SLS file, my personal preference, and I see this a lot, is to put things inside the files directory. A lot of people just keep all their SLS files and all their other normal files just kind of jumbled together, and it kind of makes it hard to track things down. It's a lot easier to look inside the files directory and find things in there. And personally, I actually, if I have something that's going to be templated, I might put it inside a templates directory as well. Whatever it is that you decide to choose, stick with it, put it in your style guide, make everyone else around you happy. Looks like you've got your Ginger files in your files directory yourself. So
I do. Yeah, I don't split those out into in a separate directory. So as you can see on the slide, my mode of operation is just if it's non-SLS, it goes into file subdirectory. But again, these are subject to your own preferences and your workflow as you develop them. And you may, I would say, although we're presenting a lot of things here, speaking with my colleagues like Joseph, I would say that, even though you're going to pick and choose the things that work for you, most of these, we probably would agree on at least 90-95% of these. And you'll see a lot of these. If you attended my colleague, his lab earlier in the week, Gary, he's covered a lot of these in that lab. So you'll hear a lot of the same ones. Maybe not all of them, but they should be, you should see a lot of the same patterns.
Another little tip for you. We work a lot with dot files, right? .bash RC, .bash profile, and so on. Who wants to be looking through an SLS tree for hidden files? It's a pain, right? So prepend them with dot, or do something to make sure that they're more visible than their default mode of being invisible. Something else, we don't have it up here, but A lot of times you'll see, instead of creating a directory, say an Apache directory with a init.sls, you'll see an apache.sls. Don't fall into that trap. It may work now, but in 6 months, you're going to say, oh, I need to do other stuff with Apache, like maybe provide configuration files, and I don't want to clog up the root of my state tree with Apache configs, right? Just start off by creating a directory for everything with a init.sls. Stick with that. It'll make your life a lot easier down the road.
So the next piece really comes down to readability, and this is going to help you go a long way down the road, as you bring people onto the team. And what you see here is really kind of a dated legacy style, and I call it the cascading style that you may see. And I really don't like this. It kind of gets under my skin every time I see this, and you may see this in older references on the mailing lists or just some of the dated documentation. However, we've started all kind of using the same style, and you'll see us moving towards that, which I'll get to in the next slide. But what you're looking at here is actually 3 distinct state declarations, but that's not entirely obvious at first glance, right? And some of the other things that are bad about this is that they reuse the ID declaration, and as we saw on that very first slide, that's the very top line in this example is called HTTPD. That's going to cause problems, especially when not only do you need to break this out because you don't want to, maybe you need to break this out and you don't want to conflict with the ID declaration because those all you need to be unique. But that's the first thing that's going to change when you need to update what it is that you're managing, right? And also when you change that, you're going to have this cascading set of tasks, because you have to now go update all of your requisites as they're called out, as you see right there in the package and the service requisites in this slide. So,
yeah, with this kind of style, you're going to have a lot of people in the future say, okay, now what's happening here? And that's bad, right? Because who are they going to ask?
The guys who wrote it.
Right. And they're busy or at a different company now, or you know what I mean? Let's keep it readable. And what he was mentioned there with you may need to break it out later anyway. I've seen a few people say, and I really, really hate this, I've seen people say, you're not Google, stop trying to act like Google. Have you guys ever heard that? Because people try to build a scalable architecture and they go on the mailing list, and the mailing list says, no, you're not Google, don't bother. Well, my take is, just do it right the first time. I don't care if you're Google or not, you can still do it right. So
this would be a much better example of kind of some of the things we've called out here. To me, this is very clean and readable. And, we've addressed some of these issues that we just called out. The first one being the breakout, the state declaration sections. So I've only shown 2 just for, the real estate I have on the slides here. But I've got 2 of those 3, and we have, the service start running and the package is installed. And so the first one is use descriptive declarations IDs, right? When I'm referring to something else, and I may even be in an include file, I may not be looking at this state that is referred to in a requisite. If I've used descriptive declaration IDs, I don't have to go back and see what was that thing doing because it was called HTTPD, right? Now I know if I encounter this that, the requisite is, install Apache package. I pretty much can guess what that does. And then moving on, we're not as lengthy, and we've got a little bit more compact syntax with our module.function notation. And really that helps you also, and beginners especially, keep in mind that that's how Salt is structured. And you're referencing the running function within the service module, right? Also, and this is a good example here, we've added some comments. Actually, before I skip on to that, when you change that ID declaration and you're very descriptive with it, that's actually not what the module and the function need to refer to, right, as the default argument. So that first argument is always name. And if you see, if we go refer back to that function declaration, it's always name in every single function that we have, right? And so that's how you pass it in, is you switch from using the ID as a default for that first positional reference to the name that we pass in here under the function and module.
Sir.
What do you mean by use module function notation as opposed to what?
So the question is, what do you mean by use module notation?
Did the previous slide have
I'll show you the previous slide. If you notice, they're broken up on separate lines. So it's still really the same thing, but it's not as obvious because if you look at the documentation, that's the same form we're giving. We're giving the dot notation if you're looking directly at it. So it just helps be clear that I'm accessing a function within this module. And also, again, keep in mind that within the states or execution modules is where you're coming from. In this case, we're writing state definitions, right? And then the last piece of this is comments. Comment well. You know, in this case, we're commenting because we need an enable. Because I think in this case, back me up here, Joseph, I believe it's because in RHEL, the service isn't going to be enabled by default on just a package installation.
That's true.
Right.
Whereas in a Debian-based system, it would be. You had a question, sir? Uh-huh.
This is that 5% where we differ,
Right.
and he's
We
going to
do
call that
differ.
out.
So the question is, on the ID declaration, spaces, underscores, whatever, I would never, ever, ever use spaces in my state ID
It's the
declarations.
developer in him.
But he's totally cool with it. He'd do that all day.
You can do it. It's a style preference. You can do that. You can use underscores. You can actually single quote safely, correctly. Yeah. And the reason I call it that one comment and the fact that we're enabling it is because if you're on Ubuntu and Debian-based distros, you don't necessarily have to do this enable as true. So someone looking at this might go without the comment, well, why did you do that? It's not obvious to me. And then the second one is, you know, if you've been using Assault a while, it's completely obvious why you need a requisite, right? But for a newcomer, this may help them go, oh, okay, I see why you have to have the package installed, obviously, before you can start the service that it is using.
So when we're templating stuff, we need to realize what exactly we're doing in each part of the template. When I say templating here, right now I'm talking about Jinja. Jinja is used really to get information together, gather it, and form it into something that can be presented as YAML or as JSON if that's what you happen to be using, or so on. You should try and avoid using a heavy amount of logic in there. Jinja, for instance, does have quite a bit of logic that it's able to use, and it's also frequently a pain to use. If you're going to be doing a lot of logic, find another place to be doing it before it heads into the Jinja. Put it into a module or something. And when you're working on templates, remember that the template is there to form data to be used by Salt later on. Don't change stuff on the system inside your template. That's not what it's there for. That's what Salt is there for. Does that make sense? So don't go in and start, doing sed-i on a bunch of files inside your template. And in fact, don't shell out at all. Avoid that where possible. Sir? Yes, calling execution functions from Jinja is just fine. Avoid actually shelling, though, because, it's going to take up more processes, right? More resources. Use informational things from the Jinja. Don't be doing a file.managed inside of the Jinja. But go ahead and, is it file.read or? Read, not write, yes. Any other questions on that? Okay. Do you want to speak to this first paragraph, this first stanza?
The templating, yeah. I just wanted to show like a very clean example of some of the things we're talking about, right? Is light looping, simple variables, and that's just a clean example. So there's nothing really complex here. If we have time, I believe I have a really nasty example of don't ever do this, so we may end up showing that.
It's nice to see what people have done wrong so you can learn from it.
I think
right?
we've all done it wrong at one point, so.
And back on style guides, the style in Salt, just kind of the general style is to use 2 tabs or 2 spaces for tabbing in YAML, right? In Python it's 4, in YAML it's 2, and if you do a lot of YAML and you start using 4 spaces, you'll understand that it's really obnoxious. So if we want to kind of encourage our users a little bit more strongly to follow the style guide, things like tab stops and so on, there are some lines you can put at the top of your files that speak to the editors, Emacs or Vim, that tell them what style is going to be used here. That first line there is it's an Emacs line. It's basically passing configuration on for formatting to Emacs. That second one is for Vim. Put them both in there. Even if you don't use one, somebody else on your team is going to, right?
And the idea there is just simply to lean on those functionality of those editors that you're already using, right? It may not be Emacs and Vim per se. Maybe it's Atom, right? If there's an add-on that helps you, format that syntax and catch those Jinja and YAML syntax errors ahead of time, then use that before you get yourself farther down the path and you're actually debugging. And I'll point out the very last example on that slide, which corresponds to the use custom Jinja filters built into SaltStack. The point of that is we've talked a bit about shelling out and gathering your information and doing things with Jinja, which I think we'll get a bit deeper into. The point here is that there is a large number of what they're called custom Jinja filters. So the SaltStack folks and the community have written a bunch of extra filters for Jinja that would be, very useful for Salt folks, and they're there. Know that they're there because for for this example here, something as simple as, is this an IP and what is it? Is it a loopback address? Is it public? Is it private? What is this, 12, 13 characters here? And I know it's a public IP, right? If you're going to attempt to do this with YAML itself, it's going to be really horrible, right? I've actually gone through the process of taking, an IPv4 address. I want to chop off the last octet and maybe increment it by 1. And just that simple, process I described, that's about 5 or 6 lines of YAML, and it's not pretty. So leverage these filters because they're there for that sort of functionality. And let me see if I can show you, because there are quite a few of them, the docs page. So here's where we start with the Jinja filters, and there are quite a few of them. There we go, you can see that sidebar. So I picked out one, but there are many, many, many. So diving further into the Jinja templating, let's point out that it's very easy to get into this and decide, well, I just want to do inline logic, right? That's just natural flow, keep things moving, and I actually started out doing the same thing myself. What you will find here is that you'll get into a position where this gets really ugly. You may have things that are nested, and you're really just trying to, usually what you see here, like the pattern shown, is that you're trying to get down to what the variables are. What are the things that are different as far as, again, Salt works off of, it's all just data, right? In this case, all we need to know is a couple of different things about what we're installing. And so there are times where you'll find yourself debugging YAML errors because there's extra white space or things you didn't expect from the Jinja rendering, in this case, inline, right? So an easy way to take care of that and make it more clearly readable is to simply pull that logic to the top of the file, pull that out, and have all your Jinja logic in one place. And I will point out that although this is a step in the right direction, it's not the stopping point. So this is just kind of this is a part of the process to make things better, and we'll show you how to further abstract this in later slides. So as Joseph mentioned, you can shell out, and we've got an example of that here. However, again, this pattern is that you're going to shell out to do something. In this case, we are doing some information gathering, just as he suggested. Keep in mind, if you're not using an execution module that will gather data and you're just passing on a couple of parameters and you grab that and you're back in this case, you're shelling out. And so you may look at this slide and you may say, well, you're now taking this one-liner and you're making it 6 or 7. Why would I want to do that, right? In this case, well, I can say, well, this is just, for one, it fits on the slide. But as you're progressing with your, developing your states, what happens if you need more information? What if you need to do some logic in that shell out, right? You've easily started to make this piece of Jinja get very messy, right? And so if you've got that self-contained in this case, it's a grain. You can see that in 4, 5, 6 lines of Python, it's very clean. It's in a fully functional programming language, and conditionals and logic in Python is very elegant, right? And that also abstracts it, right? So somebody reading the Jinja just sees, oh, I've got the status of SE Linux in this case. I got it. Your brain moves on. If you have to parse all of this and you've got some really nasty shell outs, that's going to take your brain off into a tangent, and then you have to loop back and go, oh, okay, what was I actually doing in this template, right? So custom grains are easy to write, and we'll even mention switching renderers, which I point out there in the second bullet point. So you don't always have to use the Jinja and YAML render pipe, right? That's very easy to switch. You can just put at the top of your file, #bang py. In this case, we'll switch to the Python renderer. And so if I need to do something where Python gives me much more power and I'm not restricted by the fact that Jinja is not a programming language, keep in mind it's templating, right? Then we can simply switch out, right? And so you can still stick with your defaults of Jinja and YAML, and then as you need to have the occasional state file in Python.
So this Python leads really well into render pipes. You've got to keep in mind the render pipes, they're already being used in whatever template you're doing, probably, because there's a default of first we render it through Jinja, and then we render it through YAML. At the top of your file, you're going to have that #bang line, and it's going to say this first pipe, this, and so on, right? Generally speaking, you're only going to have 1 or 2 of those things, okay? Because your templating engine gets everything put together into a data style format like YAML, and then YAML can be translated easily into a data structure that Salt knows how to understand. You could use the Py renderer and only the Py renderer, so #bang py, and just write everything in Python and then return a data structure. You could do things in Python and then send it to Jinja and then maybe do it in JSON. No, don't do that, guys. The person that looks at it next is going to hate you. Okay, there's a number of rendering engines available. This is only a list of some that are there. You'll recognize Jinja, YAML, JSON. You guys know that JSON is functionally YAML? Not a lot of people know that. It's a subset, is that what you call it? I'm sorry?
It's a near subset.
A near subset.
One or two obscure things.
Are there? I'll have to look into that. Apparently there's a couple of obscure things in there. A couple I want to point out here that are really popular are GPG is huge for, securing your SLS files. That's really important in a lot of organizations. NACL is another one that uses the NACL library instead of GPG. So those are some good ones to look into. Now, go ahead. There we go. Something else when we're building states, don't repeat yourself. You guys have heard this a lot, right? Don't repeat yourself. Make something that can be used in a lot of places and then include it in those places where it needs to be used, right? And then after it's been included, then you can go ahead and overwrite or add to things in there. So maybe we make a really generic state that handles packages, and then we want to just do one or two things to those packages for each individual package. And so we put that really generic data in a state, in this case, aux.td agent. And then I take that state ID and extend it to add, so when you're extending things, here's kind of the basic rule. If it's a dictionary item, and I know these all look like list items, but if it's a dictionary item like name, source, and so on, then extends will override whatever is there. Generally speaking, if it's a list format, like you see at the end, we have require, and you add another require to that, lists will be appended. You're not going to overwrite whatever list is there, you're going to just add to it. Does that make sense? Okay.
I have a quick question on the include. Is that an absolute or relative file location?
I believe it is relative.
So is it possible to include states that are above where the state is?
I was going to say, I believe it's absolute. So
It is absolute?
we might need to look that up, but yeah, I think it's
Okay.
absolute. And one thing else I'll point out quickly before we move on is keep in mind that you only have one extend section. So if you duplicate that, you're going to have issues. So to kind of, further that data abstraction that we talked about earlier with the Jinja formatting, where we pulled out the logic and those variables up above, to take that even a bit further is to actually pull them out of the file altogether, right? You're going to see this pattern if you look at, or you're familiar with our SaltStack formulas, right? Formulas very heavily rely on the map files that we see here. So the idea behind a map file is to pull everything you need to do out in terms of data and data that may change, render that, get the right set, and then have those ready to go to apply and to have the Jinja render out those variables for you in the state file. So in this case, we could pull those values out that we saw before into our map file, and we can do filtering based on OS. Here we've got 2 different distros, and you might take a look at the grains filter by function, so it makes a bit more sense. But by default, it will use the OS grain. I believe you can override that to filter on other things. And then your original state file that we saw before, you would just simply pull in this with the SLS utils renderer. And because I've mentioned that and said you should use it, I'll also warn you that there are several different forms of that. So just be aware that you'll see some different syntax. These are all relatively equivalent, except I believe the last one, the Jinja one, will only handle Jinja, and you'll see that one referenced quite a bit. The other top 2 are a bit newer. And if you're on pre-oxygen, you would use the one on line 3, and if you're oxygen or later, you would use the first one.
Now, as far as troubleshooting is concerned, and a lot of you guys are going to recognize some of these lines at the bottom there, it's really helpful to know in what order things are processed through the SALT compiler, including the part where they're rendered into a compilable form. So first off, you would normally have your templating engine, something that gets it ready to look like data, and then that data is represented to us as YAML. But then SALT is going to take that YAML, or even the information that's given to it from Python or so on, and it's going to turn that into a piece of data called a high state, okay? And that high state is actually a compilation of all of the states, the entire state tree that's being used, all into one big file. It's something that would still be readable to you. It would just be much, much larger and probably a lot more unwieldy. Then it's going to take that information, that high data, or high state, is going to turn into high data, which is a much more compact version of that, something that's a lot easier to SALT to understand. It's still much easier, or very easy for us to understand as users, but it's starting to get more compact and a little bit less readable. And then it's going to turn into what's called low data, and low data is starting to look pretty unreadable. This is compiled data, something that SALT is actually going to be using internally to pass along to functions. And each individual function is going to get its own piece of, its own low chunk. And that low chunk is going to be the SALT interpretation of basically a single ID structure inside your SLS file, right? Now, if you want to take a look at these things, you could say state.show SLS. You could do a state.show high state. If you want to see the high state, you can do a state.show low state, and so on. Also, test equals true. Raise your hand if you've ever used it. Okay, raise your hand if you've used mock equals true. Okay, so the big difference here is test equals true actually has to be accounted for inside the state module. It's going to go through and say, oh, I don't want to perform any changes, but I do want to check and see if it would actually work if I did this, right? And so it has an informational part of the code that does that. Whereas mock, it's not even going to go that far. It's going to check and make sure that things are constructed properly. And then state.apply is really kind of the way to enforce that state, to apply the state now.
So this last piece I wanted to call out, here's, I wanted to list just a handful of tools that I know Joseph and I both used to help test some of these states. Of course, the online YAML parser or equivalent tools is always good, right? It's just to be able to take your YAML and parse it and make sure you're doing things correctly. One of my favorites that's just very fascinating is Gingerbread. If you've ever seen that, it's a really neat project. So you can take your pillar and your grain information and a state with your Jinja in it and render it, and it's going to render in browser and show you what that would look like in your full YAML render. And so that's a pretty neat one. Our colleague here, Daniel Wallace, is actually taking over maintaining Kitchen Salt, and it's really had a lot of work put into it by him, and so I'd say check that out for sure. And then one of my favorites as well is SaltStack, and SaltStack was actually a presentation on our last SaltConf last year by a guy named William Cannon, and as of the Oxygen release, it has been included in Salt itself. And SaltStack is a unit test style of verification of states. And so the idea is you would take your state tree and those directories you mentioned that are very shallow, and you include an extra directory to do your unit tests that you describe in SaltStack. And SaltStack is able to leverage all of the execution modules that are within Salt. So you can actually have a different part of your team writing your unit test to test and make sure your states are idempotent, they're doing the things you expect them to do. So check that out. It's very powerful.
Okay, we're about a minute or two over time, but if anyone has any questions, why don't you come up here and talk to us so we can let the other session or the next session come in here. Okay, thanks guys.